I am going to talk about the results of a study which was done with FranceAgriMer. Now, much of this was done in the first part of 2021. So, of course, the situation has changed since, and you've heard the different testimonies earlier, which are kind of alarmist. This is the first part of the study. And the second part, we've tried to test using the biblio and trials to look at the invisible contamination. And you're going to have to wait right until the end to know what that is. So let's look at the plan. Here we are. That just gives you a resume of what's been happening in the first quarter of 2021. We really focused our research on PAs. That was the main issue at the time. And the idea is to try to see initially with the people that we've interviewed to talk about the knowledge of this issue, the knowledge of the regulation, current and future. And once we have given them the information of what we were doing and what we knew about this subject, what did they think about the challenges in front of them, the challenges for the country, for their company, for production? That's all that's written on that slide. That tells you how we did it. And moving on nicely, we got 206 players, people that were contacted by email or phone. And here you'll see the replies. And out of the 206 then, 44 never replied, even though we did call them again and again. So that's about 20% of these 206. Then you've got 77, so almost 40% who responded negatively. They weren't going to answer, so they got back to us to say they weren't going to get back to us. And then we had 85 who gave a positive response, and we were able to use their answers. Amongst the negative responses, roughly 2/3 said that they weren't particularly interested. Some said it was because they didn't have time. Some said, you know, what's this regulation that you're talking about? And 22% felt that this didn't really concern them. And this was because people who produced essential oil, as you know, there is no PA in essential oils. There are no, excuse me. And then other people said to, you know, maybe talk to my representative at union level or at cooperative level. So who were these people interviewed? Well, we separated them into 3 groups. Upstream, that's production. That's roughly 2/3 of the people interviewed. A small third was downstream, transfer processing industries, and then, of course, 8% associations and unions and syndicates, etc. And now here you have a chart of what's happening upstream, the share of organic, conventional, and mixed production. They had a questionnaire on an Excel sheet. Julia asked them. They had to tick the boxes depending on their answers. And this is what we were able to extract. You can see for the smallest surfaces, it's particularly organic. And for average and large services, we're going to have more conventional producers or mixed producers. And the biggest producers are really mixed producers. Now, if you look what that represents, that's a little table you'll find situated underneath the table. Our poll then focused on 20% surfaces on organic and the rest in conventional. And of course, we had to recall the mix to have a proper share. We're roughly about 80-20 anyway. And then in FranceAgriMer, published in 2020, they think that organic is about 80% and conventional is about 82%. So, of course, the idea is to check that even if we didn't have all the branch, all the sector included, we had a good representation, particularly for the surface division between conventional production and organic production. Now, what do we have? We have the types of farms, the number, most exploitations, most farms with producers were organic. If you want the files, you can get them on the AgriMer site. It's easier to contact organic producers because many of them were quite near the station, and also because often they're used to using the internet, and it's fairly easy to regroup them and find them, etc. There are many companies who do it less, who work a bit more traditionally, they can see their supplies, etc. But many organic producers are on the internet quite constantly, so it's easier to identify them. So here you've got the share of different productions, different farms. Now, I'm going to remind you of the regulation I talked about earlier. It came into application this year in July. Here are the different categories which are included of all the different dry goods from the food industry, plant-based, with the limits that they have in ppbs. These are micrograms per kilo, excuse me. And you can see that there are infusions, herbal teas, dried goods, with the exception of some that will be at 200. Rooibos, aniseed, lemon balm, chamomile thyme, odorless vervain. You can see they're all at 400. The tea, you've got 65. You've got food complements, and plant-based, you're at 400. You've got pollen-based, which are at 500. Borage, 750. Dried herbs, except for the ones underneath, for example, borage and liège. That's at 1,000. And for most of the samples, they came from Turkey. That's where they were rich in PAs. Cumin, it's the same. These are oregano and cumin. They're about 99% of all the warnings we have on the site. You heard about this earlier at the beginning of the afternoon, the concerns we have with oregano. Now, right beside that, and the 2, 4, 5, 10, that's the number of plants you have to manage. So if you have 2 a day, it's 4 grams. That's just basic maths. And tisane, it's 5 grams or 10 grams. So when you put together these quantities and you look at the content in ppbs, you get the values. And then we cannot go beyond 1 microgram per day. That is the threshold. And that's what I said earlier. So either there's a real danger and you can't eat them, you must put them all at 200 or even 100, or that's justified, and in that case, this is 1 microgram per day that's not justified. So the two can't be right at the same time. Silence in the room. So this was an estimation, the number of weeds, you can see them in green, and the number of plants to have to reach 100 ppb, and at the left you have the yield from your parcel per kilometers per hectare, raw material per sector, sorry. And in the first one, in green, if you've got... Right, so this here you have an idea of how many weeds you need per hectare. For example, you need 3,000 to get to 1,500 ppb. And the richer the alkaloid and the APs, etc., you see from the weeds up at top, you need very few weeds per hectare to go beyond the 100 ppb. So good luck to any producer to get under those values, under the 0.5, for example, per hectare of your parcel. Without using your hands, without any products, etc., it's extremely difficult. So here are the responses when we asked if they were going to feel the impact of this or not. So, and also, sorry, this was their level of knowledge of the issue at hand. The companies that thought that they really did understand the alkaloids as about 33% of the producers, which is 97% of all the surfaces that were questioned. There were only 11 that had never heard of it, and these were farms of less than 15 hectares. Now, the second curtain was that we were estimating their knowledge by asking them questions about PAs, if they knew the regulation around this, etc. And we thought that roughly 2/3 really didn't know, or didn't know particularly well, the regulation or what PAs were or what was going to happen. When we say, oh, we, it was myself and Julia. Julia informed them using the table I showed you earlier what was going to happen, giving them a list of alkaloid-based weeds, saying, do you have this? And if you do, how are you going to react? It's a little disappointing to think that 2/3 of the people were really not au fait with what was happening. Information that had been given out over a certain number of years regarding this subject. It's quite sad, but that's the case. Then you have the number of companies who considered that there was going to be quite a heavy impact on them as a result. Well, that was about roughly 60% of the companies and roughly 95% of the turnover declared. Okay. Once we gave them the information, the majority of the companies thought that they were going to feel the impact of this regulation and by the issue it would raise. Downstream then, so these are people who are going to transform, people are going to get the product to market. Well, you have the figures. Some said 9, I should say, out of the 25 odd that were, 23, I should say, they said 9. They didn't feel that it was going to be a problem for them. And that's because the client doesn't demand any analysis off from them. That was for the first quarter of 2021, but I should think that things might have changed from that since then. Then we asked about the impact of this new regulation. Well, it was principally the people in the cosmetic or essential oils sector that thought that this wasn't going to have an impact on them. No, it's an expression that's been used by a couple of presidents, but it's too vulgar for me to use to quantify this. What were the reasons behind this? Well, for the downstream industries, well, the main one was the difficulty of the sector to ensure the absence of PAs. 9 out of 23. You could put as many responses as you want on the sheet. Now, then, and we touched on this earlier, the rupture, stock, being out of stock, so some raw materials, some vegetable, plant matter, cumin, etc., are difficult to supply. There was also the lack of capability to be able to keep the levels up in terms of PAs with regulation. There is a text available from a conference last year on PAs, which stated that in spite of all the efforts that have been made over the last 4 years, there was still about 50% of production which was not compliant with the PA standard. It's in pharma, but it's extremely important. So the Germans are actually beginning to question the speed at which they wrote their initial appreciation. You have people who've talked about the problem links to sampling and batch analysis. For some, it's going to be difficult to bear the cost of this regulation, making sure everything is compliant, and can they actually knock this price on to the price they add to their client? Some are going to do better than others, but it really illustrates the difficulties which might appear with this regulation. So these are some of the examples of the batches that were quoted earlier. It's difficult to compare that to the turnover of a company, but some batches are very expensive, some are not. Some are going to be able to sell to different markets. For like distillation, they're going to look at the export market. They perhaps look less at PAs than we do. Now, if we asked people for their opinion on these plants, they were worried about the use of them. You have a whole list here. They are listed by those who are perhaps endangered. You've got the species down the left. You can see they're all there. You've got borage, thyme, mint, Californian poppy, and on the other side, I believe you actually have hoary cocoon. And you see the figures, what's going to happen if you stop production. We've heard from the different people who were speaking, all the measures that have been put in place to try and improve the situation technically. When a crop isn't working, we say, well, we have to try a crop to replace it. So you've got also, when you stop the purchasing, it's the same figures. And you have to add lemon balm to that, lemon vervenin. And again, your hoary cocoon, which has many PAs in it. Your hypericum is one of the plants that was really important in the French agency before saying it's one of the 10 species which you had to be particularly careful about because hypericum was always subject to contamination. Keep that in mind. The second part then after this poll, and you'll find all this on the FranceAgriMer site. What happened next? We're going to talk about the invisible sources of contamination. What are the visible sources? Well, it's the ones we see. No secrets there. So you've got byproducts of weeds and PAs, everything, all the ragwort, etc., that is visible. And then you have other sources which are not visible. It's all the rest, basically. We've looked at pollen. These are productive plants. They produce APs. What quantity are they in the soil and what impact do they have on the crop and the PAs? Then you've got contaminated soil. This is fairly invisible. You have to look, and what about lateral transfer? When a plant who produces PAs can free them up in the soil, and through migration, this can be absorbed by another plant in the soil. So that's lateral contamination. And this is comfrey manure. So comfrey is a borage in origin, and it's so enclosed within the PA. It's particularly trendy when it comes to protecting crops or during crop, but that's not my job. And EFSA has rejected a demand because they wanted to have this comfrey manure as a base substance, and they said no. We don't have enough information for that particular field, and we don't have any data on the presence or not of PAs in the manure or in the comfrey. So in March 2021, thank you, Simon, you're here. What did we do? We prepared some of this comfrey manure. We let it stink in a room for 4 months, and we were able to carry out analysis. We didn't find any of the 28 PAs that were researched or searched for within this method. So this is a very encouraging result. It's just one trial. We'll have to validate it. We'll have to do it again. But I think it would be interesting to do some sort of like disappearance kinetics using looking at the comfrey we use. What quantity are we going to find the longer we leave it? Do we find it at all? And then we set a timeline. We say at the end of it, when do we no longer have anyway? This is just one avenue for research. So I don't think there's any risk with 4-month-old manure anyway. Another area that was suggested was pollen. Sorry. It's difficult to get a lot of information on pollen. It's an enthralling subject, but unfortunately there's a great lack of data. But when you talk at the amount of PA in the pollen, well, or in certain flowers that are pollinated, because there you can collect little balls of pollen from the bees, and we're able to carry out analysis. But it's very difficult to find any kind of productivity in pollen in a plant. Well, I'm going to show you some data. The sweat of my brow here, I'm able to show this. You have them all in front of you. So for the first two, you've got PAs in the pollen. You know what this is. As of the 1st of July, you can see this at the end, at the side of the road. You've got little viper biglos. It's a very pretty little plant, that really draws in the bees. But it's pollen. It enjoys pollen. Then when you look at the amount of pollen that can be produced by these flowers, and a lovely, you've got a plant of viper biglos, then you can see the number of flowers that are on this plant. Especially when you have important quantities, pollen plays a major part. I've given you a simulation here underneath. You've got 10 viper biglos flowers produce 5 milligrams of pollen, which gives rise to an average value of about 100 micrograms of PAs. And if the pollen from these 10 flowers land on a gram of dried mortar, say of lemon balm, we're at 10 ppms. If this is spread then to a kilo of raw material, we arrive at 100 ppm. So it's wonderful to have all these calculations, but this is a hypothesis which has to be considered. Pollen and a number of weeds can really contaminate the crops that are growing right beside the road. And that's why it's important for us to look at this. We had to try and remove from our study all parcels which were beside the roads where there were weeds or any kind of plant that might have a high content of peas. Still looking at viper biglos. If you put your bag, people who go and collect this flower by the side of the road, what happens? Well, they might stand on some of the plants. That brings about the creation of a kind of juice which then flows into the plants. But it's invisible. Okay.
So our Italian colleague, I think, was saying that on 50 meters around the plots, you should avoid any weed with PA in them. So maybe it would be an avenue. But so looking at avoiding pollen is an option if you keep clean edges around and clean parts around the plots. Here it's on ragworts parcel. Just through the rain, there's water off. If you analyze the soil, the water, with the runoff, you see that you can find some PAs, and it depends on the rain. So the rain can actually create runoffs. Maybe dew could do the same, and maybe the plants can absorb that PA present in the PA, they can absorb it, avoiding the Caspary frame that Mr. Legendre told us about this morning. We don't know how it works yet, but we do know we do find it after analysis. We did it in Chemillé because we have a lot of ragworts for some reason. So we tried to isolate a dozen plants in a plot, and we tried to avoid the contamination. And at T0, we actually sampled or collected the plant. We collected the earth or the soil around each plant, 10 centimeters around it, and every month we would take a small sample 10 centimeters away from the places to see if the PAs had migrated in the soil. What are the results? You have the dates. So you have the pot frag, you have earth on the roots, then you have the earth sample, and etc. So we took earth samples and we didn't find anything. So it was basic reward with 2 per 1,000 PA, 20 ppm in the root. In the earth stuck to the roots, it goes down to 11. The earth under the roots, nothing. So is this hypothesis of PA migration from the root has been demonstrated or not? Well, through a clever calculation, comparing roots and earth on the roots through secondary and tertiary forms, so silicylionine and retrocin. So we made a ratio with the silicylionine as well. First ratio, the ratio is 10, and the second one is 3.6. For the root, for the earth on the root is 2.5 each time. So my interpretation of that is that it's not bits of root that were stuck to the earth. We were really careful not to get any part of the root to analyze the earth stuck to the root. And something I haven't presented yet is that it was non-possible, given the quantity of collected root, that it would pollute the very small portions of earth that we collected. So my conclusion is that right next to the root, you can find low quantities of PA, probably from the root exudates. However, there is no migration observed in the soil. But I discussed this with Laurent Legendre before starting the trial. There are so many types of soil, and maybe this year the conditions were not appropriate. There was not enough rain for migration, or there are so many notions. But we still found traces of PA in the earth surrounding the root. So maybe our method of quantifying the doses in the soil should be improved. As we were taught this morning, roots do absorb a lot of water, even if the concentration is non-detected by our methods. There will be liters of contaminated water going through the roots of other plants. So the water will evaporate, but the alkaloids will stay in the plant. So if we find measurable PA quantities in plants that do not produce alkaloids themselves, that would be a hypothesis of how it gets there. So I'm available to questions about that. We tested another thing. It's the PA behavior in distillation. There was some bibliography about that with a few species, and they don't find alkaloids in essential oils. And I told you maybe that we do have rugworts in Chemillé. Well, so we made rugworts essential oil. We distillated it. So the red framework is zoomed in under, and the sample with essential oil, which is added, to which we add silicylionine, then we find PA. But if we don't, we can't find it. And there are people from Robertet who published an article. If we distillate to get rid of PAs, so they worked on 2 essential oils. One, I think it was eucalyptus, one by distillation, the other one by pressure, which was orange or lemon, I think. In each, they added some alkaloids, and then they redistillated, and they tried to look for PAs. So steam distillation does not take with it PAs, so there is no PA in the essential oil. And still, we got a distorted piece of information recently from Nathalie Duchère. Some German labs are wondering if maybe we have enough arguments to say that there are no PA in essential oils. So more work for the labs, great. And that's my conclusion. So on our website, we have great publications with great illustrations. For instance, on the left-hand side here, an inventory on most PA-producing weeds in France, in continental France. And sometimes you don't expect a certain plant to produce PA, so it can be tricky. And on the other hand, we have tropanic alkaloid in Solanaceae plant, and we have other in our pocket, or up our sleeve. So thank you very much. You can stay here because there might be questions. So the audience can ask questions to Denis before we move on to the last presentation. There is a question. Stéphane. Do we know what is the remanence of these PAs in plants? No, I didn't find any accurate information. We have information on silage, where it does degrade fast. Other fermented products, it degrades fast. Other tests or trials on cakes, but I don't have any information for the remnants in soil. But these molecules are like rocks. So unless because they're ester, if there are enzymes like esterase that are passing by, they might degrade them in the soil, but it's unlikely. We don't have enough information to, well, for analytical reasons. A few articles in which people give quantification of PA in soils, but can it be transposable for every soil? This is a question we wanted to ask at the beginning, but it was not part of what we could test. So we could only test a few hypotheses, but it's a very interesting question. It probably depends on the type of soil. Following migration of PAs would be very interesting, and see how long they stay there, because it's one of the invisible contamination, as Emmanuel Beson was kind of saying. If the plot has been disgusting for 3 years and suddenly I clean it up to put some thyme, it's not a big surprise to find PA in my harvest, even if I don't find heliotropes or rugworts on the plot. Maybe the soil is loaded enough for remanence to occur. But we don't have any information, accurate information on that. But for other places, we know how we can find it. What I observed on perennial cultures in 2021, we had cultures that were filled with PAs. In 2022, on the same plots, no positive analysis. None. Was it the same lab? Yes, Eurofin. Not to advertise them. So same lab. So in my soils, at least, PAs did not last the year. In that soil with that type of plant, yeah. An article describes productivity in PA of a plot containing rugwort. I think it's a kilo per hectare of PA that it can produce. I can't explain if it's the plants grown there that pumped everything, or maybe it's the microfauna that has an impact. We still have everything to learn about it.
Je vois pas d'autres mains levées. Ah si, une devant.
Another question, maybe? Denis, I am going to defend the system and you're not going to like it. On your slide with calculation, the quantity consumed with 2, 4, 10 grams of herbal tea. I think one herbal tea bag is between 1 and 2 grams, so 1 and 2 grams. And for the pharmacopoeia, they count 5 to 10 grams. But the most important is that it's a great example of difference between risk evaluation and risk management, because we have values way above the EFSA recommendation, because the EFSA made a scientific calculation on what you must stay below not to have toxicity. It's so many grams per day. And then the Commission will use other arguments to set their thresholds, because that product, we know that they always contain that much, so we don't want to reduce the sales of it, so we'll keep that threshold. So maybe the toxicity evaluation should be taken more into account. Well, with the preceding opinion from the EFSA, they said that they had raised the threshold to put pressure on producers to make sure that the volumes would be reduced, and that then after a few years, they could reevaluate their threshold. And to me, it doesn't make sense. Was it the Commission or EFSA that said this? It was the EFSA's recommendation. I think it's 2018 or 2020, I'm not sure. It keeps them busy because they keep publishing about it.
Monsieur Cassard, je crois une question derrière.
Mr. Caffard, I think you have a question.
Ce sera la dernière.
Last question.
Oui, donc l'EFSA a dit que c'était
So EFSA said it was 1 microgram per day.
Donc à ce seuil-là,
with that level, is it a level at which something starts happening, or is it the level at which we're sure that nothing happens? Because I agree with the EFSA opinion, 1 microgram cannot hurt anyone. But maybe with 50 micrograms, you're still hurting nobody. So to me, thresholds that is interesting is how many micrograms leads to the first negative effects. I couldn't read the reports finding this answer. Yes, when they explain they used 10 or 50 to 237, or I don't remember the figures. What they're saying is that 1 is quantity to be reasonably safe from cancer. So with 10, you're not reasonably safe. Well, they haven't expressed it that way. So with 100, are you in danger? That's information that I wish I had. Well, we're talking about absorbed quantities. So let's say you're taking 1 pill and you're absorbing everything. In a herbal tea, there was a study published in Belgium. Only 40 to 60% is transferred to the water. And then the absorption by the digestive tract is still less. For mice, apes, depending on the trials, whether it's been radio marked or not, but it's between 75 and 85% after 24 to 48 hours. So a large part is leaving. Yes, we are not rats, but clinical trial specialists are doing all their trials on rats. So, all the thresholds we have are based on rats. I'm not a psychologist, but there's a reflection on the RAF's portal. There are a lot of alerts for batches of oregano, etc. So some lots were probably way above the threshold for years, which means that batches that were 100 times above the threshold, that means allegedly very dangerous. And we're talking about full containers of 20 tons or so. And I've never heard of any consequence. So Well, there are examples. Rooibos, the red tea, which has been fashionable for at least 25 years. It, according to publication, was contaminated in 100% of batches. So for 25 years, people who drink rooibos every day have been, roaming down their throats a lot of PAs. So we should know if it's a real issue or not. It's the whole professional trade that is strong enough for having, shut that off, but not strong enough. Well, the rooibos trade union, are they syndicate? Are they that strong? They might be sponsoring the South African team, but apart from that, they're not, that strong. Thank you, Denis.